beginning, and I still do. I notice that with breath as attention, when I am in flow with my practice, it just connects to everything. It's hard. It is it's hard to lose it because I see the connection with breath essence to everything. But when I forget, I notice that I hold my breath in certain circumstances. Um, I pause my breath, I hold my breath, and then there's a whole bunch of things that go along with that. I tend to clench my teeth, my shoulders come up. There's a whole bunch of things that go along with it. So as soon as I remember where's my breath, I don't try to manipulate it. In the beginning, I used to. As soon as I would say, "Where is my breath?" I'd take a deep breath, and then go, "Okay, you took a deep breath, and then what'd you do with that?" But there's so many physical things for me that I'm either conscious of or not conscious of, based on the breath. The breath is always the first place to notice that. Hmm.
Yeah, I noticed exactly what you said. Like, I'll do that too. I'll when stressful situations, I'll tense up and I'll hold my breath, and then I notice my stomach's tight
Right.
and I'm all tensed up all the way up to my shoulders. And
Yeah.
yeah, I get what you're saying. But I guess I noticed the breath, and then I noticed that in order to get my breath back to normal, I have to relax everything down. So that for me, I have to focus on my feet. And then that helps relax my stomach and my shoulders and everything. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things attached to it. And even if it's definitely tension. It doesn't have to be something I'm perceiving as tension. It could be a problem to be solved. And I'm not even recognizing that I am looking at it that way until I realize I've held my breath, my teeth are clenched, my shoulders are coming up, all those things that you feel, is that, oh, I'm focused on solving a problem, on changing something, on trying to control something or whatever. I don't even make all the words. I just notice it because my body is a clear example of that.
yeah,
Um,
same for me. I feel that
yeah, except I
everything that
don't
you're
get a
saying.
tight stomach. I don't think I've ever had a tight stomach in my entire life, Shayna, but you'll have to tell me about that sometime.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, so the if we start with the hydrostasy procedure, step one is to establish the four directions. And one of those directions is breath. So, I mean, obviously we want to have at least one point of attention all day long, but it is possible to have all four directions simultaneously. And so if we're not going to talk about breath all day long in the beginning, we're definitely not going to talk about maintaining all four directions simultaneously. Because then that will sound incredibly daunting, but I can assure you that it's possible. And you can still function, so you can still do things with these established four directions. So, I mean, I do work at work, I do stuff at home, and I do it all just fine with the four directions. Now, the four directions, of course, is coupled with the four modes. And that's just a way of looking at it. That shouldn't really be a point of difficulty by the time we're doing hydrostasy, right? So the idea that it's with the four modes is really for discussion purposes, but ultimately we know that already if we're doing this practice. So establish the four directions within your four modes, and that should create space, and I call it engage the space. So what I mean by engage the space, and so this is my procedure. This is what I did this morning. This is pretty much how I start my day. I start setting up my practice by establishing my four modes, and then I start engaging the space. And what I mean by engaging the space is I'm willing to bet that if somebody were to put sensors on my head and I were to really think about the world's problems for 12 hours, they would get a different reading than when I'm doing my practice for 12 hours. Does that make sense? Thinking about the world's problems.
Well, because there's thought. I mean, isn't in attention on the space? The space is the place in your mind without thought.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, my video's not working. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so exactly right. So the space is being created because of our four modes. Or excuse me, our four directions in our four modes. That's what's creating the space. It's very difficult to think thoughts or to entertain thinking thoughts again. That's not the end of the world. What we don't want to do is indulge, which is essentially the stream of thought. We don't want to dive into a stream of thinking. And so with your four modes established, those streams of thought just don't stand a chance. And with those four modes established, you see everything, well, everything isn't the right word. You see a lot more of yourself in the moment, not thinking about yourself, observing yourself. There's a difference. Does that make sense? And so I'm describing, and then I'll give you more detail, but this is how I set up my practice in the morning. And just like Qigong, if I'm sharing it in that Qigong book, that's because I do it. So I waste no time. I actually start in my dream, but the moment I wake up, I start to intend my points of attention, all four directions. Does that make sense? And the hydrostasy
You
practice,
intend them the moment you wake up, but did you decide them before you went to sleep?
well, I would say that they're in the Qigong practice category. So they're all in that toolbox. So they are, intended, but it's not like I intended it the day before. No, I go back to the classics. Does that make sense? All right. And if I start to notice thought that is within the warrior training, the traps of thinking, I go back to the warrior training portions of the practice. I redirect any thoughts that are trying to figure it out, comparing and contrasting, thinking about what I want, thinking about myself, thinking about other people. Again, a thought occurring is different than me allowing a stream of thought to sweep me downstream with it. That's the imbalance. Okay, so engaging the space that is around the forehead area. Once the space has been created, then I deliberately modulate. And I start with what I would call we used to call this abstract quality, and we still can, but we would call it the artist's edge. This is a little bit difficult to describe, but everybody should know what I'm talking about. But the equation is care, focus, equal quality. So we start doing this in day one of the Qigong practice. We care about the present moment. So we're going to give it our focus and attention, which brings out a type of quality from the moment. Does that make sense? I know we had a few people join and I don't know if you're able to respond, but that's okay. But does the idea of the abstract quality of the moment make sense? In warrior training, before we start hydrostasy, we'll play with that a little bit in terms of trying to perceive, or, I'm putting the word trying in air quotes because it's really not that difficult, but perceiving the silence behind the sound, the non-movement behind all the movement, the empty space behind the object, that can start to bring out the abstract quality. So that's kind of a way to practice. But does that make sense? There is a background abstract quality to the present moment. even when you're sick. I had a stomach ache yesterday or the day before yesterday because apparently peanuts are, they're kind of messing with me a little bit, but my stomach was intensely, I was very, very nauseous, and I could still sense the quality. So of course I took the opportunity to check, is that quality still accessible despite the fact that I feel like death? Like it, of course, extreme nausea, nobody likes that. That's a terrible feeling. So yes, it is still accessible. It's still there. It still doesn't make me feel good. Like I'm not going to say that abstract quality makes the stomach ache go away, but it is still there. That's all I can say. Does that make sense? And now I'm describing my practice, and this will also be in the Igong books, especially in the hydrostasy section, the hydrostasy book when we get there. So the other points of deliberate modulation for me, also the abstract quality is also kind of where imprinting will occur as well, because I'm paying attention to that abstract quality of the moment, and other aspects of the moment are revealed through that underlining abstract quality. So
Well, that's how you got to the abstract quality anyway, right? Because you're doing warrior training, and this is how I remember it for myself. You're doing warrior training, and your practice has built some momentum. So, you've eliminated. I eliminated a lot of the voices in my head. The A lot of the devil's advocate is gone. The trying to reason why I'm doing this. Why am I doing this again? Why do I care about this? Like I understand it because I have experienced the relief of of non-thought, or at least of reduced thought. I can feel the relief of it, and that feeling becomes a desirable way to be. So therefore, when you start talking about the abstract quality of things, I can recognize it as something I've experienced. I don't know if I've imprinted, but I guess I have. If I can reflect on it and go, I couldn't help but notice that. Like that we did a lot of that in warrior training. The group did a lot of that. I couldn't help but notice that I was in this circumstance and I applied these techniques, and then I had felt this. We started talking about our feelings a lot more in warrior training, and not the feelings of positive versus negative, the feeling of relief, the feeling of the overall reduction of thought. And everybody had different examples of that, but that's what we were talking about a lot. And so once you recognize, I couldn't help but notice that it wasn't that we were thinking about it, problem solving it, trying to understand. It was something that we felt as a result of the practice. And then once you feel that space start to be created and the feeling associated with it, then you can understand as you started to introduce the abstract qualities, because we were stumbling upon them, or we were discovering them as a result of the practice.
yeah, and just to clarify, so what I'm talking about, and it's a bit tricky to talk about, but it's not plural, so it's not qualities. It's an abstract quality that emotion and things can come from, but it's not necessarily an emotional state itself. The abstract quality is the human being's ability to sense the unseen or the unknown. And that is difficult to explain in terms of how do we sense it? Like, where is that sensory mechanism occurring? So I'm not really prepared to go there, because there are some things that I just don't know, but we do, and we can. So what I'm talking about is more, and sometimes I'll call these the baseline, like my baseline techniques. They're what creates the foundation or the entry point to qualities that come from the background of abstract quality. And like, I know, Ida, you might not be able to chime in right now, but like, I know you get this. And, Donna, when you're taking your walks, along the beach and everything, I know that we all get this idea of an abstract type of quality to the moment. So all I'm saying is that And then and that's why I use it almost as a form of sensing energy, because finding that basic quality, just that basic background quality, which is, we have what we would say is maybe known, which is physical matter, things that we can see, taste, touch, hear, that we can directly interact with. And then we have everything unknown or unseen, at least, that's more difficult for us to perceive. Maybe we need instrumentation to perceive that electromagnetic, heart thing that we're creating. So it's binary like that. So what we're so used to interacting with is the baseline of everything physical. Now we're starting to interact with the baseline of everything that we would consider non-physical, and then a lot of other types of quality, or other types of feeling that's more specific to everything else, the totality of that moment. It'll have certain flavors and certain qualities, but the abstract quality is kind of a baseline blanket type of thing, if that makes sense. And understanding that abstract quality isn't really it's does not need to be an intellectual pursuit. Therefore, intellectual explanations aren't completely necessary, because by practicing, especially when you do the Qigong practice, by trying, and I'll put that in trying because maybe a person isn't familiar with it, but by trying to sense the silence behind the sound, the space behind the object, that is the technique that will help reveal the abstract quality. So there are techniques to help a person kind of get there. But we're talking about hydrostasy. Those techniques are introduced in warrior training. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I thought that's what I kind of just said. But yeah, the techniques are introduced, but I don't know. I think that for me, I only pick techniques because they resonate with me, because I've had some taste of them. I've had some experience of them. I think I have some understanding of what that is. And that's why you often said throughout class, when we start talking about that stuff, you kind of kept it on a shelf until there were enough questions about it from the group that you could tell that the group was there, that those kinds of techniques are more can be described more like an art. It's the art of practice as opposed to just a technique, because it has to have some momentum behind it, some degree of attention behind it, before you introduce it. There needs to be some space to even
Well,
go there.
yeah, keep in mind that I'm describing the hydrostasy, and the very first step was, checking into that, creating that space.
Of course,
This is
of
all,
course, I know
yeah,
it falls within the organization very well. I'm
yeah.
just talking about in the experience. It's the art of something, and that's why you'll refer back to Ida and everything can be taken to the degree of an art if you use that as your point of attention. So I've noticed that, and I'm sure you have, because a lot of what you do is in a psychological healthcare field area, when you were at the dispensary, when you're at the acupuncture clinic, these are all in the area of well-being. And so I'm sure there is somebody who could learn all of the points. I had an acupuncturist who loved her points, and she used to teach it at the acupuncture school, and she was just so well versed in her points. But because of the commitment she had to her practice, she also had an intuitive quality about it. Wasn't all just science. It wasn't all science. It was predominantly what she learned about acupuncture and how to deliver it and what's required. But there is also an ability to see beyond the sight, smell, hear, taste, touch, and knowledge base. It included something else, so that she took her acupuncture practice to an art form. And there's a difference. There are doctors like that. There are there are nurses like that are excellent diagnosticians. And it's really, their level of experience has a lot to do with it. But how they pull it all together and perceive it in this one human being just by the way that they're presenting themselves, along with the information, along with the science, along with the experience. There's an unseen quality that they can zero in on that makes their ability to diagnose an art form.
That's as the mind gets quieter. That's what I'm noticing happens quite a bit.
Yeah.
It has a lot to do with a quieted mind, because when you go to the doctor's office or whatever healthcare professional, and or your tax professional even, are they sitting and listening to you? Like, are they really listening to you? Or are they just doing the numbers in their head? They can be doing the numbers in their head and listening to you if they've taken their practice to an art form. But you can sense that the quality of that energy of somebody who is taking in a lot more than just the facts that are being put down on the paper or in the computer.
But it is more, I'm noticing. It does include doing the full practice.
It has to do with how much space they have created in their brain to allow for, their focus on this moment with you. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things about the Qigong practice, though, is that it's going to give techniques to help a person get there. So, and the techniques are, for the practice sake, it's non-negotiable. That's why it's Qigong, but the art isn't necessarily in what you do, but how you do it. So, all of this in a sense is an art form, of course, because it's how we get to where we want to go with our cognition. So, and so this is hydrostasy. So this is assuming that we're maintaining at least one point all day long. So there will be cognitive space already created. That kind, and step 3 is engage the space. So yeah, what we're talking about here is a mind that has created gaps in the overall amount of thinking, so that the abstract quality is far more accessible, and it can become a point of attention. And the reason I'm listing these is because it will be a part of the Qigong training, because the Qigong training is what I do. That's kind of where the training comes from, is I'm kind of explaining exactly what I do with my own cognition, and I've listed the results, like what we can expect. So the abstract quality is something that I check into right away, and I consider it kind of a hybrid between deliberate modulation, because I put myself there deliberately, but it's also a sensing energy, because that's where all of the, in plural, qualities will come from. And this abstract quality is a very binary type of thing that I'm talking about. And it's a balance thing. So what happens when the mind is in its common place? The lens of perception is what we would call common. That mind is imploding in on itself, creating bubbles of thought and focus on common things, the world, taxes, more money, relationships, career, others, themselves. This is where the light of attention is going in on that all the time. So where does their attention go to? It goes to physical things. It goes to cell phones. It goes to computers. It goes to television. Sometimes even they'll look at the environment and they'll be like, oh, this is beautiful, and then just immediately go right back in to the thought processes, if they ever even really stop them to notice. So there's not even really gaps in nature and things like that, because it's just not getting enough of their attention for long enough. So this is the common lens of perception. And so what the brain is doing, what the body is doing, what the mind is doing, is focusing on the known. Does that make sense? It's especially if it's thought, because you can't think a thought about something you don't know. You can't. Your mind can organize things. Maybe you didn't have it organized before and now you do, but you still knew it. You still had those words, you still had that information. It was in your brain. Does that make sense? So that is always the known. So there's a gross disproportionate imbalance in the human experience because the light of attention is always focusing on what they believe to be known. So one of the things that the Qigong practice and bridge addresses is some of the most fundamental imbalances in the human experience. One of them is the focus of thought. Where does that focus of thought go? So just thinking too much. Where does that thinking too much go? It goes on self. Where does that thinking from self go? It goes on physical objects. So what we're doing with the idea of the background is now we're starting to put our attention on the unseen, the unknown, and that creates a type of balance between known and unknown. Does that make sense? So
Yeah,
this is,
Ern,
yes.
I was wondering, I'm starting to feel a lot more balanced, and I'm noticing that I don't need or don't want to talk as much. There's like no need. It's just it's getting even more quiet, I guess.
Yeah, when we're noticing things about our practice, I think one of the things that has helped me the most, and this is kind of a tangent, so this isn't setting up the hydrostasy practice, but one of the things that has always been very beneficial for me is the idea that time is the great revealer. So no matter how I'm feeling now, no matter what I'm noticing now, no matter where I think my practice is now, I want to be careful not to think about myself too much and start to think thoughts about Ernest and his practice and what he can do. And I'm not saying you're doing this, Karen, but also one of the things, and I'm not definitely not saying you're sensationalizing or anything like that, but one of the things that could, and sensationalizing is just a form of indulgence. We're starting to, it's cherry picking. We're starting to allow an imbalance, even though we know it's an imbalance. We can feel that, oh, we've had a feeling, a great sensational experience, but now the cognitive aspect, we can see that it's starting to get imbalanced and it's going away from the moment, and we're starting to indulge that energy. We're trying to elongate it. We're starting to get attached to it. We're starting to want it more often, that type of thing. So that's just an imbalance. We're violating the balance principle, and in some way that will cause suffering. One of the points of attention, one of the things that I would do as a mantra to redirect from any type of indulgence is to remind myself that time will reveal. So if maybe I'm feeling a lot of enthusiasm about something, that's okay. I can feel a little bit of enthusiasm. That's not the end of the world, but time is the great revealer. So I'm just going to wait. That's kind of the mantis mentality. I know what I'm waiting for. I'm just going to wait for things to reveal themselves, to really see what's what. So when things are coming up in our practice, one way to not sensationalize it or think about it too much, or to start categorizing it and putting it in a box, because we don't want to put it in a box either. We want it to be free. One way to do that is to defer to time as the great revealer. Time will reveal everything to us. We just have to pay attention. Does that make sense? So you're noticing that you don't want to talk as much. Just let time reveal what that's about. Do you see what I mean? Don't have to, consider it too much or wonder too much about it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, because I noticed it in this moment, but you're saying don't focus on it.
Because that can become a new rabbit
Yes,
hole. That can become a stream. Is
yes.
even trying to think about it and observe it and understand it.
Well, what came to mind also is I got, I got that job and I got enthusiastic, and then I heard, stay grounded, back, stay in this moment.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep. What do you mean, Ida? Things become keepers or not? I don't know what that means. Keepers.
What you were saying about time will tell. I sometimes start things, or in the past I would have started things and been all enthusiastic about it, and then 2 weeks later or 2 months later it
Exactly.
wasn't to be seen. When you had a book sitting on the shelf that you thought, imagine I thought I was going to do that every day, whatever it is. But I find that through time, if you keep quiet about it, just practice it yourself, keep on having the experiment with yourself. It's such a personal thing. I've begun to realize later years that I don't want to tell everybody all about it because it's well, it's not that it's important, but things become keepers. I find you find that you want to do them every day, so then they stay, and the other things that were maybe superficial or not meant for you or not part of your true desire kind of fall away. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yeah, we want the desire to be as close to the intelligence as possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, there's so many times I'd have an aha moment. I think I just had an aha moment. And even somebody else, I would say it, and even somebody in the class might say, that's brilliant, because they chose such perfect words to say what I was, my aha moment. And you were like, yeah, write it down.
Because I
Like,
really,
write it down. Like, maybe it means something to you, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's an aha moment, maybe it's not. Maybe it's a step, and maybe it's not. It's just something happening now, and your light of attention is on it, and maybe it gave you new understanding, and it doesn't need any more recognition than it did just in you recognizing it. Who knows? But as you continue your practice, your lens becomes clearer, and then those things will, like Ida said, become keepers or not. They may be directions, they may be paths you want to move in. They may be useful to you for a new technique. They may be something that you notice in a new space that you've created in your lack of thought in that space. Who knows what it means? It doesn't have to mean anything. It's just something you noticed. So that's good. Or not. It doesn't matter.
and you know, what came to mind is about like something new occurring, the job. I just had it occur where a thought came in the future, what will I be doing, and seeing myself in that job. And it's like that thought bubble taking me away from the present moment that you were talking about. I'm just getting clear on.
Yeah. What really occurs is that the thought becomes a stream, and it becomes a roaring rapid, and that's what we call rabbit holes, traps of attention, traps of thinking, and it leads to another imbalance. So ultimately what this practice is doing, I say ultimately a lot because it's doing ultimately quite a few things, but we're restoring balance. Balance is one of the, if not that non-interference is, a primary principle of this practice. And the human being is imbalanced in several ways. One is the sheer volume of thought that is so imbalanced. And then what are we thinking about? Ourselves, which creates a self-reflection. It creates a view that we have about ourselves. Remember, I was talking about I got a massage and I was sore all over. I felt like someone rolled me down a hill. I didn't know that I was quite so squishy, that I had become so soft because I had this vision of myself. And it's like, where did that vision, where did that idea, where did that view come from? It came from thought. It came from a perspective of myself that I had given my attention to time and time again until I believed it. Do you see what I mean? And then that's my lens of perception. And then, I'm walking around thinking that I'm not.
And there's nothing new. There's no new, you got excited about this new thought, this new observation, and then your own thinking made you ignore anything new that's happening. I remember this coming up in class a lot for many of us at different times, but a lot in class through the process is the idea of something new. I think it was Lisa, but I can't remember when it got in my brain and stuck. I mean, everybody's talked about it, but just looking for something new. Is this a new thought? Is this a new observation? I mean, looking at the abstract as a technique, the abstract quality, it's always new, right? If it's something that becomes old that you keep noticing over and over again, I think once you pick a color, the color blue, how often you go, wow, I didn't notice how many. I remember Gene and I having this discussion. He said my color was yellow today, and I didn't recognize how many things. I thought I was going to have a real challenge finding yellow things. And he goes, I can't believe how many things are yellow that I just don't notice because it just becomes the blur of nothing new. You're not looking at the world with fresh eyes. So it's really not so much the color yellow. It's so we can do that with our thoughts and with ourselves. How quickly I got a new job, I'm in the flow because I was relaxed, and how quickly that becomes a stream of thought that's about what am I going to do in the future, and I'm going to prepare for it, and this might be a good idea, and that might be a good idea. And I can totally understand now why Ernest would say, write that down, because they all might be really great, innovative, inspirational paths for an unfolding for you, but you don't know that yet. And thinking about it isn't going to reveal that to you. Only time will tell. So write it down, go back to your practice. Write it down, go back to your practice. And then that may take root and grow and come to fruition. And you will, you will follow that unfolding while practicing.
Mhm. Yeah.
There's thoughts and then there's awareness too, which are two different things. I'm
Yeah.
talking about awareness more. And yeah, there's awareness and then there's thoughts.
So now when we talk about, okay, so I'll this is a little bit of a tangent, but when we talk about the 4 directions of attention, one of those directions is cognition. Cognition includes recognition, and that's what we would use the word for awareness.
Yes,
Awareness, if we're going to break the word down, awareness, it means conscious recognition. Conscious means above the threshold of active recognition. Does that make sense? So if we're aware of something, if we talk about awareness, we're being very, very specific in this practice when we use the word awareness. Deliberate cognition, or recognition in the moment, what we're able to recognize. That is
yes.
also post-processing.
Because there's awareness of the thought coming in the moment, and then there's getting stuck in the thought. You can be aware of a thought, but not get
Yes.
stuck in it.
You can be aware of a thought and not get stuck in it. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Attention is separate from the thought, so attention can be on the thought.
That's what I'm talking about. Like I see the thought, it's an awareness. It's not following that thought and making a stream into a big river, but it's awareness.
And
You could get caught, I could get caught in it, but first I have to be aware of it.
you have to be able to recognize and observe the thought with, especially above the threshold of active recognition. That's the key, because
That's the difference.
a person's attention and their focus can be on the thought, but there's not necessarily active active is the deliberate nature that we're looking for in this practice. So active is incredibly important word.
Right. That's what I was referring to, not getting caught in it, but being able to recognize it. Whereas before I couldn't even recognize. I was like, if I had that thought of seeing me in a job, I would go into it. But now it's like, oh, there's that thought.
Exactly.
Here I am.
Yeah, and so Lauren, when we talk about recognition of what degree we're thinking, that's when we're really in our counterbalance and we're starting to do our redirection technique, because we're paying attention to ourself, like our mind and our body and our thoughts. And so because of the sensory attention training and the cognitive attention training, we are able to recognize to what degree. And you could look at that as like a river, or it starts out as like a little trickle, but the more we give it attention, the more it becomes a roaring rapid of thought. So then we're able to see that. And then what do we do with it in this practice? We redirect it using the rule of 3. Those thoughts must be redirected. Recognition alone is not enough. You can recognize something, but it's your mind. There's no subject and object. So we're either allowing ourselves to go into the rabbit hole, or we're redirecting, and the same goes for sensationalizing. So here is some of, and this hopefully can shed some light. One thing I'm going to do in warrior training is I'm going to talk about productive thinking. We list the traps of thinking. I will list what we view also as productive thinking, but again, that's still subject to the balance principle. So creative thought, that's very productive. Trust me, creative thought can get out of balance. And then you have all these ideas and all this creative thought, and then you're not really doing anything. You're like drowning in a sea of creative thought. So these are the fundamental, I'll put this up here, fundamental imbalances in the human experience. Number one is thinking. That's the number one imbalance in the human experience. Number two is the focus on self. And when I talk about self, I'm talking about, again, or what kind of focus we're thinking. So thinking itself is these are the imbalances. Thinking is the biggest imbalance. Most of the thinking is going to be focusing on ourselves. And then Lauren, true to what you were talking about, another imbalance, one of the biggest imbalances in the human experience is indulging. Sensationalizing is a form of indulging. Indulging is allowing yourself to exist in an extreme. So let's say that we're all talking about how money is, balance, right? We want balance. We don't want to say, I don't need any money, because then you're not going to eat, right? But then you don't want to say money is the most important thing in the world, because now we're in an opposite balance, right? So we're looking for a balance with money. We can say that, but then what about when the money starts coming in? What about when all of a sudden you look at your bank account and you got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, $10 million, and you're like, you know what? I'm going to just go ahead and take 6 or 7 months.
Yeah, I hate it when that happens.
Yeah, right. So then we start indulging what is occurring, and then before you know it, we're not practicing, we're back doing the same shit that the rest of the world is doing, and who knows where our experience is going to go from there. Does that make sense? So the one of the fundamental imbalances in the human experience is the tendency to indulge. Indulging is a form of cherry picking. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, and that's where awareness comes in, because when I'm aware of that, then I could come back to the moment and not further indulge. It could be a moment versus days of indulging, becomes one moment of awareness. Yes, that's what I'm noticing.
And remember, just so that we don't get too abstract with the way that we're speaking about it, your techniques of attention, especially the Qigong practice, that brings you to the moment, because we talk about awareness, that's how you're aware of it. If you're not anchored to the moment, if you're not paying attention to the moment, you'll only notice it in hindsight. Maybe it's 15 seconds of hindsight, maybe it's 15 days. So the cognitive attention, the sensory attention training, that's how we are aware of it. We're able to see it in the moment because of the practice.
Right, and before, not being aware of it, I would just go into the indulgence or the sensationalizing, but now I am aware of it, like, oh, I'm feeling more balanced, more peaceful, and then, oh, I'm starting to think like that. It's like more very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I prefer active recognition, because sometimes people will use the word awareness to just mean information. They have accumulated some information about something, so now they're aware. So maybe right, and that doesn't make it active. Just because you've accumulated information about crossing the street or looking both ways, or that there's a lot of traffic, and people say, oh, thank you for making me aware of that.
That's a great point. It's
right.
No, it's not that at all.
That's not what it's an active recognition.
Yes.
And active implies present moment awareness, present moment recognition. So going back to Lauren, we have indulging as one of the fundamental imbalances. And then the tricky one that is really one of the main things that I was kind of explaining today is the tendency to focus on the physical. That's not physical. Or the known. So for those of you who have problems, where do those problems exist? I can assure you that they're almost always going to be in the physical. Your job's not going right. People aren't doing what you want them to do. You're beating yourself up because you're not doing what you want yourself to do. all of these things, you're not getting the recognition that you think you deserve. You're not getting the luxury vacations that you think you deserve. You're not getting the money or the respect or the this or the that, or, I want new shoes and I want to, go see movies and I want to travel and I want all these things. First of all, I want is a fundamental imbalance. It's a fundamental, because you don't need to think about what you want. You already fucking know. Like, you already know everything that you need to know. You know what you want, you know how to get it. But we start to get into these disproportionate tendencies of just thinking about it all the time. And so one of the most fundamental imbalances, and this is the sneaky one, is the tendency for the human mind to use attention to focus on the physical. Does that make sense? And there's this other thing that we have, and I can't explain it. And I have some ideas, but I don't know for sure. But we're also able to perceive and interact with what we would call the non-physical, the unknown, the unseen. We can feel it, we can sense it. And one of the first that is easiest to access, the easiest to talk about, is the abstract quality. Day one of Qigong training is helping you prepare for hydrostasy, because why are we paying attention to shadows? Why would you pay attention to reflections? Because they're like an interesting in-between physical and non-physical. The breath is an absolutely amazing in-between physical and non-physical. Physical, non-physical. It's like it's there, but it's not there. I know that it's there, but I also can't see it. So it's like in this interesting place between known and unknown. Light. Yeah.
That's a great point. That is really spot on.
So this is kind of a spoiler alert, but that's one of the imbalances that this practice is looking to address, is the human being's tendency to focus on physical. So now I want everybody to think about your non-physical desires. Where are all of your desires and wants in the non-physical realm of things, the things that maybe nobody else can see but you?
The way you have put this together really amazes me, Ernest.
Thought, it's thought,
Excellent.
it's thought. It's this practice has even my desires that, a lot of them have come from thought, they've come from thinking. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking about self. I recognize that what kept me at this practice is, geez, I just get sick of the sound of my own voice in my head. Like, how many times, like the whole idea of how many times have you said that or thought that? What a waste of space in my existence that I've thought that thought 1,000 million times. And it's based on what? I don't know. I don't even know. A belief that is fragile at best. It's just something I chose to believe.
Because people say, listen to that still small voice. And really, it's the abstract of what you're talking about, noticing shadows and different things like that.
Well, that's inner guru. That's the voice that arises in the space of non-thought, not the repetitive habitual thought.
Yeah, and the more you practice, the more that you're creating the ability for intelligence to coincide or to collaborate with desire. So before you know it, your desires are intelligent desire. And how do you know they're intelligent? It's win for everybody. It's win for everything going on.
Yes, and that starts occurring more consistently.
Yes.
Much more consistently.
Desire
in this practice too.
Desire is very unreliable if the lens of perception is muddied by thought.
About the self.
Because, well, yeah, I mean, that's where the thought is come. I mean,
I would feel
guaranteed.
better if they behaved differently. I would feel better if my bank account said this. I would feel better. I'll feel better when I'm employed or I'm unemployed or I'm retired, or I will feel better when. It's all about self.
Yes. So the fundamental imbalance now that we're addressing in hydrostasy is the tendency to focus on the physical and the known, because in this practice, and especially in hydrostasy, we start to focus on the unknown, the abstract quality of the moment. And there were techniques earlier in the practice to help us do that. In addition, there are techniques to help us feel, and these are where I put my attention at the beginning of the day, on these feelings, on this deliberate modulation of emotional soup, energetic, vibrational, everything all in one. So and these are basic because these are what I would call the baseline of moods that I want to create. So the abstract quality, the abstract moods, deliberate modulation, these are all words I could use interchangeably. So abstract quality is one, and then I'm using Thich Nhat Hanh's definition of happiness being a type of contentment. It's feeling content because you have everything you need. Especially if your Maslow, hierarchy of needs have been met, then your physical is taken care of, actually. That's really all you need physically is what you need physically. Does that make sense? So that's the physical is taken care of. And then we have all of this other space that we can interact with. And there's a form of contentment. And we do start to create that day one in the Qigong practice, especially in counterbalance, but finding contentment with the moment. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And there's also a trusting in the moment. I don't know see if I could put words to that. Trusting in the inner guidance. A trusting in the inner guidance. It's like I don't have to think so much or figure it out anymore. I'm not quite sure how to phrase that, but
yeah, I think that's fair. One of the things that I do avoid, I definitely don't start to touch on certain ways of looking at trust and faith and even belief. So the practice doesn't have a lot of belief. It doesn't require a lot of faith because it's empirical. You can feel it as you do it. So
yes, that's true.
The
That's
only
a good point.
The only trust factor I need is to go back to the practice. That's it. Just go back to the practice. That's the trust. Otherwise, and you maybe have seen this, but the air quote spiritual community, they've just created a religion that doesn't have rules and doesn't have a name for their deity figure. But it's really all the same shit. They have faith in the universe. They believe in this higher power, and that's not wrong or anything, but it's the exact same thing as any other religion.
Oh, yes, because those words do get tricky. There's so many different meanings to it, just like love, trust, faith.
Yeah, so the Qigong practice specifically will be very careful with any of those words. If there's any trust required, there's just trust in the practice. Just go back to the practice. The practice will take care of everything else, and that's the principle of non-interference. Just get out of the way and everything else will take care of itself.
Yes, get out of the way and it will take care of itself. I like that. I like that phrase.
A lot of times with the everything is working out for me and, the way that we have faith in the divine and the higher, again, that is all typically just going to trace back to thinking about yourself. That's the reason that we need to think those things is because we're still just focusing on ourselves and what we want and our desires. And it's the same old, really.
Well, it just brings on a lot of thinking and a lot of people discussing it and what they believe is the faith, and this one believes it's the faith, and
yeah, I just don't have time for
a
that.
lot of excess. No,
Yeah,
Yes,
a lot of waste.
just being devil's advocate here. I know that when you hear those catchphrases, they become subject to the interpretation of the person, and then it waters down the whole thing. And then what are we talking about? I get that. But we have all of those here in this practice too. And that's what my mantras are. They're really just, they're words that resonate to a concept for me, and not a particular thing that it would take me a long time to define. If somebody said, there is only this moment happening now, or there's, trust in the moment is something that, Karen may say to herself, and it may mean something that isn't watered down. It may have a very specific, it's her mantra maybe for the day. So we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, that's a great point too. It's like our vocabulary is shifting, times are changing. And what I usually say is, be present now. And that's one of my mantras. Come back to the moment, be present now. And
Yeah,
then I don't get into thinking of faith and where the guidance is coming from. So
It's
that
just a
helps me. But-
technique. It's just one of the techniques at Anchor
Right,
Point to get us
everybody's
back to the
different.
practice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everybody's different, what works for, but what you said about, I guess that comes in trying to describe it, and that's what I mean by less words. A lot of things, I just am noticing that I don't need to speak so much and use words, even with doing certain things at work or in life. Yeah, it all kind of goes together.
yeah. And so when we talk about, because we have ways of describing what we're talking about, and it's productive self-dialogue. So if your productive self-dialogue is, the angels have my back, and that makes you feel better and you go back to the practice, fine. Qigong will never recommend that. So that will never be a recommendation. The recommendation that Qigong makes for deliberate or for productive self-dialogue is logic, using forms of logic to cut through emotion. So for example, maybe somebody's yelling in traffic. Nobody can hear me anyway. That's a very logical, it's like I'm yelling at somebody who can't hear me.
That's so funny you
There's
say
no
that,
logic.
Ernest, because
So
I
where
was,
does there is no spoon fall into the explanation of it?
That wouldn't be in Qigong, because that was something that just made me feel better. Yeah. So something in Qigong, though, is going to be more specific to the practice and less esoteric or less, belief steeped, if that makes sense.
Well, I was laughing because you said logical, and I was trying to describe something one day, and you had went back to the logical, and then I realized it's important because you're teaching this to be logical. Otherwise, it does get into all this abstract BS. So I understand where you're coming from much more now.
Yeah, and logic can be reinforced and it will cut emotional response. So sometimes when we're having an emotional response, we can use logic to help back that response down a little bit.
Yes, yes, and it works quite nice.
And that's introduced in basic alignment of Qigong. I talk about using as a form of productive self-dialogue, logical statements to yourself. And I give a few examples of what that looks like, but yeah, that's the type of thought process that I would recommend for the Qigong training. Okay, so we have contentment. So these are feelings that I'm feeling right now because I checked into them at the beginning of the day and I maintain them all day long. I don't really step out of these anymore. So the abstract quality of the moment, that's kind of the artist's edge. Everything has kind of this dreamy, infinite quality to it. And that's addressing the imbalance because that's not focusing on the known. This contentment, that's also something inside me that other people can't necessarily see. So it's a little bit closer to the unknown as well, just like the abstract quality. So if these make sense, then in addition to the abstract quality, in addition to contentment, do these make sense so far though? There's also sensations, physical things that I personally check into. And if we're being devil's advocate, I'll say chi is electrical.
Chi is electrical.
No, most people will tell you that chi's not electrical. If you're talking to somebody about chi and they're like
Uh-huh.
a qigong practitioner or a martial artist, they'll tell you that no, chi is a life essence energy and it can't be defined. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, but it has an electrical quality too.
Yeah. with acupuncture, you kind of see that as well. Because you can have electrical stimulated acupuncture. So it is showing that maybe it's not just electricity. You know, chi could be a different quality of electricity, but that's just a way to kind of bring it back to earth for somebody because chi can be a very mystical thing to somebody. You know what I mean? When you say chi, prana, they're like, oh,
Yes.
so a way to make it less mystical for somebody is to kind of describe it in terms of electricity.
Yes, to describe it, till you put words to it. Electricity. Yes, I got what.
Yeah. But if you talk to a practitioner, they'll say, no, that's not true. But what is true, you know? So emotional essence or, you know, Jing is most often associated with sexual energy. But I kind of put all of the different emotional soups into Jing. Does that make sense?
Yes, keep that up for one moment. That's
Those are-
really helpful to point these out.
In Tai Chi, these are considered the three treasures. And they're abstract. Donna can't tell that I'm sensing into any one of these three, you know, just by looking at me necessarily. So it's a little bit more on the unknown side of things. So again, it's focusing on the unknown as opposed to just the physical all the time.
Oh, yes, I see that. That's why trying to describe it can be, like if I'm trying to say something to you, it could be quite difficult for me.
So
But
what are we
I think you
talking about now?
understand.
What you're deliberately modulating to? Is that what
Exactly.
we're talking about?
Yep.
Okay.
And this is also what I'll start to call the 8 directions of attention.
Oh, that makes sense.
The 8th one is the abstract quality.
Oh, this is really helpful. I appreciate you going into this. And they all go together.
They do. So
They really do.
the first 4 directions of attention are external, internal, breath, and cognition. And you can maintain all 4 directions at the same time. And then you can add in these abstract ones and you can feel them with the 4 directions. So you can actually be doing all 8 at once.
Oh, this is really helpful.
Okay, so in hydrostasy, you said first thing when you get up, you're establishing the 4 directions within the 4 modes while engaging the space. And then you have the 4th one is deliberately modulating, which is really just an extension of the 4 modes. Yes. I mean, which is an extension of the 4 directions.
No, not necessarily. Because they can be maintained with the other 4 directions. So I'm still focusing on the space while sensing into the background essence. So
I understand, but
yeah.
number 4 you have as the deliberate modulation, right? We've got 1 as 4 directions,
Right.
2 as 4 modes, 3 as engaging the space, and 4 is deliberate modulation, which really is an extension of 1.
Sure.
I mean, if it's extended into 8 directions, then yeah, it's the same. It's just a more fine tuning of the 4.
Specific, yeah.
Okay.
But I would say though that establishing the 4 directions, I'm doing the beginning Qigong technique still. I'm still paying attention to shadows and reflections and things on my skin. So no, the 4 directions is more the beginning tools that we use. Does that make sense, Donna?
Yes.
Deliberate modulation is kind of an extra thing that I'm doing in addition to those other techniques, because I don't stop doing peripheral vision just because I'm sensing into the isness of the moment, or, you know. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
It's like in a much more rudimentary way, I'm saying that when I use breath as a point of attention, then everything, what Shana and I were talking about in the beginning of class, that breath for me, everything else is the domino effect. But breath is a foundational element that exists while I'm doing the other things.
Exactly. So I'm still doing the breath technique as a part of my 4 directions, despite the fact that I am getting into these other, you know, deliberate modulation, these other moods, or sensing Qi, Shen, Jing, and at least one abstract quality.
That's why it's the 8 directions in the
Yes,
moment. It all goes together.
and it can all be held simultaneously.
Yes, that feels really complete.
And it also gives you a lot of different things to do because it's the abstract quality, but I've listed several abstract qualities as one of the 8 directions. And you can kind of bounce around between them just depending on where you put your attention. Does that make sense?
Lots of sense.
So still listening behind me, still looking at different colors and different shapes and listening for different sounds. And I'm still doing all the beginning Qigong techniques throughout the day. That's one of the biggest things about this practice is you build on it and you continue to do all of it. Not just I've graduated to level 10, so I can forget all that other stuff that I've ever done.
It's just the stuff to do with the space you've created, and the more you practice, the more space you create. So then there's more stuff to do with the space you created.
Yes. And then
Mhm.
so dream walking is the feeling of no burden.
Could you go into that more? The dream walking?
Well, the reason I call it dream walking again is because in a lucid dream, your nervous system knows the difference. Your nervous system now knows that you're dreaming and you don't respond to everything in your dream the way that you normally would.
Oh, okay.
So something can jump out at you and you don't just lose your shit because you know that you're dreaming. It's a type of knowing. That same type of knowing can come out of the dreamscape because you're not giving all of your problems thought. You're not thinking about all your burdens. And so the defining characteristic of dream walking, and so you know that this is an effect that you may be feeling if you're neither bored, or at odds with the moment.
Okay, I like the way you also said a knowing type thing is the dream walking. And comparing it to lucid dreaming. That's helpful.
So it's a lot like lucid living.
Except that there's also
And it-
an extremely adaptable. You're extremely adaptable. Like you you can differentiate dream walking from, like, I don't know, a hallucinogenic drug induced experience, because in in dream walking, you can be amongst, I mean, space junk can fall from the sky and you just immediately adapt. There could be you're not tripping and falling or spilling because you're not paying attention. You're so paying attention to the present moment that you can adapt to any unexpected fluctuation elegantly. Sometimes I notice that when I am, people think you're daydreaming because you seem like you're not existing with idle chatter, and you're not saying hello and good morning to every person. You may be, but whatever. Um, but you're not detached. You're hyper attached. As a matter of fact, you're tuned in to so many different interactions that when I don't know, somebody's about to fall, or they go to drop something, you catch it in midair and hand it back to them and walking. Or sometimes I see those things in hindsight, like, I can't believe I just did that. I wasn't paying attention to any of that, but of course I was. I was paying attention to all of it. That may have appeared to be that I'm in a daydream, but walking and daydreaming are very different things. A
Very
dream walking and daydreaming are very different things. Yeah.
totally different things. Yeah.
They might look the same to others, but they're not.
Mhm. It would
I
be,
don't,
Yep.
yeah, I don't think others, well, from my experience, I can only speak from my experience. I don't think I come across as I'm daydreaming at all from what I've heard. I'll put it that way.
And then I did forget. So one of the directions of attention, or one of the deliberate modulation aspects that are created through the Qigong practice, is appreciation. So I will help set these 3 up with the Qigong practice: the abstract quality, contentment or happiness, and appreciation for the moment. With those 3, you should have a pretty good day. And true to Donna's point, when the dream walking kicks in, you are supremely adaptable. And now this is what is required for the 6th technique of the active alignment. It's also what's required before you can do the hunting power. And it's what is required before I introduce what I call the abstract principles. So the abstract principles are principles to remain in the abstract quality, because you live in a physical world. So you're always going to be able to balance physical and abstract, but you're not going to sensationalize. And if you do, it's going to be art. Like you're going to, paint a painting or create an interpretive dance or find a new way to do something that's really cool, or, so there are creative ways. Poetry, they're trying to communicate the abstract, the feeling, the emotion, the quality. That's what's hoping, the artist is hoping to convey. So ultimately, this technique, this setup is what the Qigong book will be about in the hydrostasy section, but this will also set up the abstract principles and hunting power. And this is all required before a person is given the green light to begin the hunting power process. Does that make sense? Hunting power will include things like deliberate folly. But
I was going to ask you to just briefly say something on that.
Hunting power is even more getting out of your own way to allow even more unobstructed flow between infinite and finite. So it equals a lot of personal power. But because I'm taking responsibility for the way that I deliver things, it's important that the hydrostasy be there first, because personal power can be misused, especially in a mind that is not balanced.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's if the mind is not in the hydrostasy part of the practice, then hunting power can actually become it could be dangerous to a certain extent, because feeling the accumulation of personal power and not knowing what to do with it, you could damage relationships, you could damage desires and pursuits and things that you've been doing,
because it exists in a
that's a great
vacuum.
point.
It doesn't exist as a result of with the other things as foundation. Without the foundation, it exists in a vacuum, and then it becomes its own thing, which is
Right.
not good.
which is
A person can
yeah,
become quite inflated, if you know what I mean. That's
absolutely, because if they're not
if you're
doing
not aware.
and if they're not doing the foundations of this practice, they're focusing on themselves,
Yes, yes. Oh, okay.
and then the personal
It's
power.
all focused on themselves.
Yeah.
It's like a black hole.
Yes,
It can be very inflating if you're not doing the practice and awareness and conscious.
and the principles of personal power, the way that I'm using it, anybody can access that at any time. So it's not something unique to this practice. It's a principle of the human dynamic. Some of the way that we talk about personal power, we will use the word confidence, but it's not confidence the way that people normally use the word, because most people use the word confidence in relationship to other people.
Oh, yes.
It's amazing how hypnotic it is to the common mind too, because that's what evil leaders, autocratic leaders are all about, and it's amazing how, I guess because in the common mind, and I of course include myself in that, in a less aware state of being, we cherry pick a lot because we're self focused. So there's a lot of cherry picking going on. So it's amazing how much cherry picking in our own view of somebody who has a lot of hunting power momentum going in the absence of all those foundational things, how we can choose, how one can choose to not see the logical, obvious inconsistencies
It also
in
goes
their
back to
behavior and
intention.
motivation. You know, it's amazing how droves of people could not see, you know, that the emperor has no clothes on. It's amazing to me. The whole phenomenon is really fascinating. And I do appreciate your personal responsibility to your delivery based on that.
Yep. All right, so this was a nice review. So the Igong book, I am adding a checklist and I'm putting quotes in so that people can have some quotes, examples, you know, that they can use. It's very basic. We're focusing on shadows, reflections, so you could get started with it really easily. But then the next one is counterbalance.
We're gonna do that as a group or no? Or you don't know yet?
Do what as a group?
Start Igong together.
I think I might do it. Sorry, I sneezed a couple times. I might do it in the form of like a workshop or like a quick webinar, because it's for this group. It's just so basic. You know, it's you guys have heard all of this stuff so many times. Yeah, but the key is you know the Igong practice is nothing you learn in it you will ever shelf. You know, so everything that you're doing you will continue to do throughout the entire practice or throughout for the rest of your life type of thing.
Sure, I think that's why originally you referred to them as pillars, because everything else rests upon that foundation.
Right. All right, any questions, comments, or concerns? I'll save the whiteboard so that I don't forget. So this is my practice as it is right now. I have already set all of this up. So when I do my formal practices, when I do my Qigong, I sense into these even more, of course. I can feel these abstract energies. And when I say the word abstract, it just means it's abstract to you, right? You can't necessarily, if I say, Donna, can you feel my chi? She should say no. Like the answer should be, no, I'm not 100% convinced you're doing anything, right? Now, I would say though, that these are the characteristics that you know that you're doing something. So I'll write these 4 characteristics at the bottom. If you are not feeling these 4 characteristics, it is time to start over. It's time to go back to maybe check and see where you've lost your practice because it's probably not there. I'm being deliberate with the words here. So I'll start with a peaceful mind, and then I'm going to blow my nose real quick. Give me 1 second. Okay, so these are the 4 characteristics of the Igong practice. And if these characteristics don't exist, go back to step 1. Go all the way back to the very basics of alignment and work your way back to your practice from there. So a peaceful mind. Now I have given a whole new standard for calm in my family and in my household, because if I do anything, they're telling me to calm down. Like if my voice even fluctuates a little bit, Shayna, everyone's like, whoa, Ernest, calm down. But that's why I always recommend doing like a husband swap or a dad swap so that they can see what calm and uncalm is. So although I do get some slack from Shayna, she'll tell me to calm down. I have to remind her that I am actually perfectly calm.
It's all relative.
It's all relative, right? But sometimes I get held.
Here we go again.
Yep, you hold me to this
Yeah.
weird standard.
Too.
Yeah, we say, even Donna says the same thing every time.
It's all relative. Ernest, calm down. And I'm like, seriously, guys, if I were any more calm, I would just disappear into the ether.
It's like when
Yeah,
I
really
do
float
when I
away.
do this, Shayna, when I do this on camera, it's stop raging at the machine. And Ernest's raging against is like imperceptible to other people, I'm sure. But I feel like, oh, here we go. He's raging against. It's probably a similar household calm down.
His
It's
passion,
all
right?
relative. It's
His
Yes, he's
Yeah.
highly passionate about it.
Shayna.
yeah, yeah, okay.
Well, no, that's not
Yes,
true
you
either.
do
you
come
know?
to my mind, Shayna.
And I even balance passion. So because passion can get imbalanced. And then before you know it, you got people telling you to be obsessed. That's the way to be a leader in business, is to get obsessed, or to be an athlete, you need to be obsessed. And I get it. They may end up being amazing athletes.
It's
And
the new influencer word. As soon as I hear a
Obsessed.
commercial of any kind
Yeah.
with obsessed, I have to just scroll past
Me
because
too. Yeah,
it's a script.
it is. That and the word hack. I got this new mind hack, and I'm like, nope, automatically not interested. I'm not trying to hack anything. And The Matrix. Like, I love that movie, and I was using that term before it was cool, but now I'm just like, no, let's not talk about The Matrix.
I think people are searching for words.
And then when I say, let's not talk about The Matrix, Shayna's like, Ernest, calm down. And I'm like, but I feel pretty darn calm. Okay, so we have a peaceful
I
mind.
don't think I've ever said that. Yeah.
Ernest, calm
I
down.
know you're making up scenarios that, yeah.
I'll point it
have
out next
nothing-
time. I'll put it up.
Yeah.
Okay, a peaceful mind, a calm attitude. What are the other four? Because I got off on a tangent. But a peaceful, oh yeah, okay. Balanced emotional state. So if I'm chilling with Mike and we're driving down the street and someone cuts him off in traffic and he starts screaming at the top of his lungs in anger, I would say, Mike, we need to go back to the practice, buddy, because we're not there. Like, we're not doing our practice if we've gotten to this emotional extreme and we're letting ourselves stay there.
You know, Ernest, what I like is you just pointed out what I was trying to put into words is that I'm feeling more balanced. It's when I start getting passionate about something, I could feel, okay, again, ground, balance.
Yeah, it's all in, because you can still do everything towards your passion and you can still be passionate, but it's our tendency to focus on things and sensationalize and indulge in certain things, and then we get into obsession and singular
It leads
focus,
down that road, yes,
And that
into indulging.
and that imbalance will create suffering. So while a person may be in the Hall of Fame of hockey, they also, get disassociated from their team because they're a closet racist. So this was a guy, he's a hockey player, and I just saw the story the other day. But so yeah, he achieved greatness in hockey and achieved nothing else in any other area of his life because it sounds like he was a complete creep.
Yeah, it's balance over all areas, just
You mean
balance.
like Herschel Walker running for office?
That type of thing. Yeah. So the principle is that indulging is a form of existing in an extreme, and existing in an extreme will cause suffering. You can also end up the president of the United States, and it can still cause suffering for other people and yourself.
And when you're aware, it doesn't really feel good to be,
You can-
at all.
Be the richest person in the world and still existing in an extreme and causing suffering for yourself and others. That's the principle. Okay, so
Yeah.
one more characteristic, and then if you're doing your practice, or whether we should go back to the beginning. I forgot to put the number 3 there, so I'll put the number 3. There, that looks good. And so 4, so we have a peaceful mind, a calm attitude, a balanced emotional state. And what's the 4th one? I know this because I'm the one that organized it, but a peaceful mind, a calm attitude, balanced emotional state. And the 4th one is a good one, but it's I need a second for it to come to me. I have it written on my note cards. Give me a second, I'll go get my note card. And the second I get up, I'll think of it.
As soon as you stop trying to think of it.
Okay. So also a point to make is that I have my note cards, I have my objects of power, I have my reminders throughout the house, I have reminders set up around the clinic. So everything that I'm recommending in the Qigong practice, I still do it. Why not have reminders? You know, just because I do remember most of the time doesn't mean that I shouldn't have reminders. Oh yeah, duh. That's okay. And then this is the one that is super important, but it is, and these are guarantees of the Qigong practice. If you're not feeling these, then we need to go back to the foundation, set up a one-on-one with me, and we'll figure out why or where we're erroring in the practice. But there should be impeccable. Does impeccable have 2 C's? Impeccable, impeccable, or able?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
Is it able or able?
Able.
Able, okay. Impeccable self-awareness. So these are the 4 derivatives of doing the Qigong practice. And there are other derivatives of hydrostasy, but these are the first 3 layers. So the basic alignment through warrior training, you should be feeling these 4 things at all times. If you're doing the practice, this is what will occur. Hydrostasy will have a few other things that are added to it, but these are the guarantees that I'm willing to make if you do this practice. A peaceful mind. So that is a mind that is not at war with itself. You're not at odds with the moment. You're not bored. You have a calm attitude. That is something that we can see. So I had somebody who their mind was clearly all over the place, try to tell me that their mind is quiet. But they don't have a calm attitude. They don't have any peace. It's like, who are you lying to, me or yourself, or both? Does that make sense? So
Yes, that feels very complete. Everything you covered feels
yeah.
real complete.
And then because we're doing our counterbalance, or we're doing, depending on where you are in the practice, because we're doing our deliberate modulation, you can expect a balanced emotional state. So a balanced emotional state means that we're not in extreme emotions. It is the limitation of the way that human beings are in the world today that we say that it's okay to be angry. If you're angry, you're angry. Go back to the practice. You don't have to try to change it or anything else. And we're not chastising one another because we feel certain emotions. But if we're feeling the hydrostatic balance, we will not get to the extreme of anger. And if we do, that's okay. Go back to the very basics. Go back to step 1 of this practice if you feel yourself angry, because you are outside of the hydrostasy circle. And notice the reason that I mentioned that is because you cannot do your practice when you're in extreme anger. They don't go together. You're in too much of an extreme emotion. Now you can come back to the practice, which removes you from the anger. But notice that when you're in the height of these extreme emotions, there's no balance. And so this practice, everything starts to go out the window. You have to bring it back to the practice for it not to go out the window with the extreme emotion. What does that look like? You're in an extreme emotion, and then the thought starts to take you away. And before you know it, you're way, way, way far away from this practice. But yet it's still also right there and easily accessible. So does this make
Can you
sense?
redirect?
What's that, Mike?
You redirect?
If you are finding yourself in an extreme emotion, I would redirect to the rule of 3. Absolutely. And that's not trying to change the emotion necessarily, but it's definitely going to make sure that it doesn't progress.
It's just removing yourself from the distraction that apparently has so much pull on you so that you can get back to your practice. That's what redirection is. Let me get out of this soup that I have found myself trying to control or responding to, reacting to in an extreme. Let me get myself out of all of those data points that I'm focused on that got me there so that I can re-establish new data points, which is here I am.
Mhm.
Where is my mind? Did I put it there? Where do I want to put it?
And depending on where you're at in the practice, Mike, if you're hunting power, then you'll actually start to identify what's occurring. So if you're starting to go into some sort of imbalance, then you would call it out for what it is. This is the social destroyer right now. This is one of the enemies of knowledge, fear right now. This is what I'm seeing. Personal power can become an enemy of knowledge. So when you walk in and you're feeling like you're king shit and you start thinking about yourself, you have errored. Right. So one of the ways to go back to the practice in the hunting power is to remember some of these little triangles that I've created, visualize them as well, but then also remind yourself of what's occurring. You're feeding the nemesis. And so that's another way of going back to the practice when you're in hydrostasy. But remember, hydrostasy has a requirement. You have to be able to hold a point of attention all day long. Otherwise, you're not doing hydrostasy. And we need to go back to warrior training. If you're thinking about yourself, you're not in hydrostasy, because thinking about yourself is a violation of the warrior training at a certain point. And then notice how often a person is thinking about themselves, and notice how many of their desires are physical.
Right, it becomes repetitive.
It is a habit also. The habit of focusing on yourself. The habit of worrying about yourself, which is self-importance.
Self-importance, and that's attached to desire.
It does get attached to desire, because the triangle is desire, intention, and will. And if your lens of perception, if you're just focusing on yourself, all your desires are going to come from that, which means that your intentions will come from that. And that's usually why we have male aggression, like underlining male aggression, because most men aren't even aware of their desires. It's not clear to them, but the desire is still there. So it's influencing their intentions. And then that's how you get these subtle attempts to manipulate and, the things that men do. I know women do it too, but it's easier for me to isolate in men because.
Right.
Yes, that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, a lot of people have desires that are below the threshold of active recognition, but it is still influencing their intentions and then their willpower, their action potential, what they're doing.
Well, yes, because it is interesting. They may say one thing and act one way, and then the desire can get hold of them.
Yes. Even worse, though, is when somebody knows the desire is there and then they're intentionally being deceivious to get their desire. Now, yeah, that's even worse.
That is worse.
A lot of people don't know that they're in the grips of the biological desire or the biological destroyer, and that all of their desires are just coming from basic biology. So
it's really interesting to be aware of it and see it.
And if you're aware of it and you can see it, then you can realign, go back to the practice, and you can realign desire with fundamental intelligence, which most of their desires in the world today are not. It's tied with consumerism.
Yes, and you can also be much more aware of all those things and what you might be getting entangled in and quickly redirect.
As long as we're using the word aware to mean active recognition, it has to have that active element. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That's a great point.
Yeah. That's why the sixth pillar is called the act of alignment or the act of adaptation, because we're in our hydrostasy practice, like Donna pointed out, we can become supremely adaptable. And then there's ways to interact with your practice when you're being introduced to a challenge. Like I had my stomach ache at the clinic. because apparently my body is processing peanuts and stuff differently. Or it's just the Trader Joe's peanuts, I don't know. But it's the second or third time eating those peanuts gave me a stomach ache. I did throw them away.
There's a whole history on how peanuts are being raised, and it's kind of like corn. You know what I mean? Like you can't get a real peanut anymore, and you can't get any real corn anymore because of the engineering of and all of that. So it's a peanut thing.
It's interesting.
Yeah, switch your nuts and see
Yeah.
if it.
I will. Because I've never had a problem with peanuts or nuts before, but this Trader Joe mix several times now, it's given me a stomach ache.
Yeah, I don't think it's just Trader Joe's, but it could be where they're bought. But it's like you can't even get it out of the country. Everything seems to be like Monsanto driven, or at least along that line. So peanuts fall into that category. It's a tough one, and it's got a lot of lectins in it. We lose our ability to balance our lectins. So it could be what else you're eating at the same time. So you might just have reached a lectin threshold, but whatever. It doesn't, just stop eating them for a while and see what happens.
Yeah, I stopped eating them for a while. Okay, so this was a nice little transition. I guess we kind of jumped to the hydrostasy part of the practice, and this in this square is pretty much the setting up of hydrostasy. And then from here, we can go into hunting power. And from there, we can also start to get into what I call the abstract principles. And the abstract principles are kind of just to help a person continue in that direction. But there's a certain point where it's completely unique to the individual. Where I'm putting my mind, I didn't list here because it's so far in the abstract, it's very hard to describe. But one of my favorite places, I'll stop the recording.